Good morning, everyone, from the state of New York. Now I'm taking over from Bjorn Eglund in Norway to help run the second half of our virtual sun this morning. And pleased to meet everybody. It's a beautiful sunny day here where I am, and we certainly hope it's a beautiful sunny day where you are too. So I'd like to start by introducing our first guest, if we can tee up the slides. Very good. And before I do that, before I even get to that, pardon me, we should do some, just a few housekeeping rules. So before we start, all attendees will be muted, which will minimize background noise. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to raise your hand and answer any questions. We will be affording some time at the end of this presentation and the presentation to follow for us to address your questions. And after this presentation, after today's virtual sun, we will be providing the recordings for you to be able to view again. This event is presented in English only. And we do, again, thank you very much for tuning in. So with no further ado, if we could go to, well, okay, so I'll introduce myself real quick. Sorry, Clinton, you'll have to just wait a second. You're the more important person here. So I'm Andrew Christopik. I'm the Senior Content Marketing Manager at Laerdal, and this affords me an opportunity to welcome everybody, first of all, to Laerdal, but also, shameless plug, please go on to Laerdal's webpage and sign up for our content so that you receive our content on a regular basis. We provide a lot of helpful tips, information, statistics, other data, articles that would be important for you in your role in simulations. So we hope you sign up for that and become a subscriber. Thank you. So, Clinton John. I want to introduce Clinton John. He is the head of clinical education at the University College London Hospitals. He is the senior operating department practitioner at the National Health System, Nightingale Hospital, London, and is the simulation lead there. But another important point, Clinton and I were talking this morning as a warm-up. Clinton, you're a Marine. Clinton served in the Royal Marines. I'm a veteran myself, so we're going to take, both of you and I are going to take this opportunity to give a shout out to all our veterans and active service members that are viewing in. I was in the Army. We have some fun poking jabs at the Marines from time to time, but just to prove a point, the Marines are the ones with the motto in Latin. So apparently you have to be old school and understand some classical literature to be able to be a Marine, either on the Royal Marine side or here in the U.S. So there you go. So with no further ado, you're going to be talking. I'll let you continue, but you're going to be talking about Nightingale's experience in setting up a mobile hospital, essentially a pop-up hospital. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Clinton. Thank you for joining us, and have at it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about my journey at the Nightingale Hospital, particularly around designing simulation and delivering a simulation centre so we're able to train people. Yes, a Royal Marine by background, and per mare per terram is the Latin, by sea, by land.
Semper Fi.
So a bit of time talking about my journey. Next slide. So on the 24th of March this year, I had the privilege of taking a phone call from the Education Workstream lead, Julie Coombs, inviting me to join a secret mission. And again, go back to my military background, anything that was secret pricked my ears up. Julie didn't disclose too much about what was going to happen, but I jumped in both feet and thought, what have I got to lose? So on 24th, we convened at the KPMG offices in central London, which is near Canary Wharf, where we were given a brief. And essentially, there was 5 points to the brief. Basically, we were tasked with helping support a workforce at the Nightingale Hospital that was yet to be disclosed to the public. We were then looking at designing a training program for a multi-professional workforce. We would need to be able to rapidly upskill this diverse workforce, and we'd be looking at training anywhere between 300 to 1,000 people a day, and we had 7 days in which to complete this task. Easy, I thought. So specifically, there was, again, 5 different streams that came out of it, and from the first picture that you saw, we were all tasked with different elements, and myself and a colleague, Vicky Nash, were tasked with looking at simulation and clinical skills. We had a brief discussion around which way we were going to divide and conquer, and Vicky very kindly offered me to look after simulation. So off I went and had a go at it. Next slide. So my plan, what we looked at was the workforce. Who was it we were going to need to train, essentially, who's coming to us? What roles were they going to be fulfilling at the Nightingale? What was the skills framework that was needed in order to bridge these gaps? We then looked at the needs analysis, and then what we looked at was then trying to sort of rate these people. How are we going to put them into different groups? So the workforce, they came to us from a whole raft of walks of life. So anything from non-clinically experienced staff, i.e. horticulturists, mechanics, any walk of life with no clinical experience, to some people that had a relatively little bit of clinical experience. And then we moved on to looking at the sort of clinical workforce. So that would be anybody that's got some clinical background. And then we looked at allied health professions, along with operations department practitioners, physiotherapists, pharmacists, radiographers, dietitians, clinical scientists, and then medics of all grades. And basically, what we were looking at were people from across the width and breadth of the healthcare setting. Next slide. So this slide pretty much articulates what we were looking at. What I would say is that for the nursing, we had people from Band 5, which are your newly qualified nurses within healthcare, and that's across the width and breadth of, up to and including Band 7s, which would normally form roles of sort of nurse specialists, if you will. But again, just to articulate and highlight that people were coming to us, volunteers essentially were coming to us from all walks of life and across the width and breadth of the country, as well as healthcare. Next slide. The next part of the plan was to look at the Nightingale Roles. So we had this diverse population of people coming to us. How are we going to put them into roles? What will those roles look like in order to staff this hospital, essentially? So effectively, what we came up with were, at the very beginning, were 6 roles. And quite grossly, it was a senior doctor, an intermediate doctor, a junior doctor, critical care nurse, a nurse, and a bedside buddy. What I would say here is that this was the first iteration of the Nightingale Roles. The whole journey was an iterative process in that it constantly changed, but this was definitely the first one that we came up with. Next slide. So once we had the who, we had a rough idea of the what we were asking them to do. That then informed what was the gap we were trying to fill. What was it they were walking into training with, and what do we want them to walk out with? And that was when we started to distill our clinical skills stations. But to bring that all together, we then looked at the sort of full immersion aspects. So to bring all of that learning, all of that knowledge into a package where they're able to then practice this with a bit of support from experienced faculty. What I would say here is that all of the roles, the Nightingale roles, were based on work as imagined. This was stuff that we thought people would be doing, or that we wanted them to do, but it was absolutely on work as imagined, which was interesting. Next slide. So once we had the who, the what, and how we were going to get them there, I then started to think about how do we bring this to life? What is it we actually need? So the first port of call for me was looking at the equipment. What is it we were asking them to upskill on or train on? And what was I going to need to be able to make that happen? We then looked at the technical support. Given that the vast majority of the equipment we're going to be using required technical support, my immediate thoughts went to the simulation technicians that are out there. So quite early on, we put a call out to simulation technicians across London and further afield, as a rich source of information, but also who are going to provide me with a lot of technical support in building the mannequins and running them. And then we thought about the scenarios. What I was very clear about in terms of the full immersion scenarios was if we created a portfolio of those, what I wanted was learning from other centres who had really hit the sort of COVID ramp up, if you will. What were the incidences they were facing in practice? I thought that would be useful, that if we were running simulations, that we should use that to augment people's behaviours or to inform their behaviours, sorry. So when they hit the shop floor, they're able to be sort of relatively familiar with something they're going to encounter. So I was quite clear that that's what I thought the simulations should represent going forwards. Next slide. So in terms of the equipment, whilst I had a rough idea of who I wanted to approach for equipment, and what I was thinking about were existing relationships with companies, so Adam Ruley, Limbs and Things, Lairdale, Medvision, Gomard, there's a whole raft of companies out there. A colleague from King's College London, Paul, very kindly provided a lot of support. So what we looked at was how many mannequins we needed for the 18 practical skill stations, part-task trainers, and how many of those would I need to basically train between 300 and 1,000 people a day. What would those skill stations look like? Again, the part-task trainers, would I need replaceable consumable parts? Would I need consumables to use on those? So thinking a bit widely now in terms of what do I need to bring this to life? And then full immersion. At this point in my head, full immersion was almost doing lab-based full immersion. And the sort of lab that we got here at UCLH is kitted out as a theatre. So that was my reference point. That was where I was going. That's what I wanted to recreate as far as possible. So where was it going to happen? So I went to KPMG on the Tuesday. The first time I got eyes on where it was going to happen was on the Wednesday, and that was Wednesday, 25th of March. And as it was meant to happen at the Excel. And I think at this point, it still hadn't been put into the media, or had just gone into the media in terms of there was a field hospital being built at the Excel in London. So we had an opportunity to get our eyes on the space that had been identified for training and induction. And I just wanted to sort of get my head around what this is actually going to look like, but equally, how am I going to sort of build what it is I'm after? What I learned was actually wasn't going to happen in the Excel tool. So where it actually happened was in a place next door to the Excel, which is called Centre Ed, which runs parallel, but you do have access to the Nightingale critical care unit floor, but it's not part of the Excel itself. It's a standalone entity. Next slide. So as you can see from these slides, so if you go back a slide, sorry, yeah. So as you can see from these slides, the corridor itself is about 900 meters in length. So the top left slide, that would be us looking east, if you will, and the bottom right slide is looking west. So it's quite a lengthy corridor. And then the picture in the middle depicts the corridor that runs parallel but outside of the building. So once we actually got into the building, I had a quick walk around, but then we had an opportunity to look at the floor plan to get an idea of what it was we were working with. So what I sort of then started to think about was what would be the most appropriate rooms for the part-task trainers. And in my head, what I was thinking about was a circuit. If I wanted to get a lot of people in and a lot of people trained in one space that's relatively manageable, I want them to be able to rotate through different stations. And again, going back to one of the previous slides where I talked about rag rating, what we looked at were red, ambers, and greens. So what would a red circuit look like, and how would I make that happen in terms of the part-task trainers, and the same for the full immersion sim. So it was quite crucial that we had an opportunity to, one, have a look at the floor plan and then work out what parts of training would be appropriately fitted into which space. Next slide. So as you can see here, this is the full immersion room. So it's the biggest room of the Centre Ed, and this was a combination of 3 rooms that was able to be opened up into one. So what I wanted to be able to do was be able to eyeball what was going on, but equally what I wanted to be able to do was then create a circuit within there. So going back to I'd call the rag rating, so the red, amber, green rating of our participants as my compass. How would I then recreate that as a circuit for some of the full immersion sim? So what I decided to do was within that space was then to create 3 parallel circuits. So we had 2 green bays, then we had 2 amber bays, and we had 2 red bays. And I'll go on a little bit later to describe what I mean by those different colors for those bays. So these were our full immersion rooms. Next slide. The problem I had was trying to translate and recreate a full immersion room, again, using the UCLH Sim Lab as my compass. Again, I wanted to recreate as far as possible an ITU bay from the Nightingale shop floor back in the center red. The problem I had was, if you look at these pictures, was it's a developing picture. So what was happening was the bays were being built as we were building the simulation center as well. So you'll see that the pictures there, it looks relatively sparse, and it was. So a lot of what I had to work on was previous experience from the faculty in terms of their experience in an ICU unit, and then try and recreate that within the center red as a simulation bay times 6, and then try and work out how I can up the ante in terms of fidelity to make it representative of an ITU bay on the Nightingale. Next slide. So first iteration of our first sim bay is here. So as you can see, we had no access to ventilators. We didn't have any drip stands. You can see a nice hanger in the background there. And you can see that we didn't have any infusion pumps, which were taped to a chair. And I thought that was pretty good going, to be perfectly honest, bearing in mind that the shop floor of the Nightingale Hospital was still being built. But I was able to sort of, or I say but we were able to recreate this and actually start to run training. So I mentioned earlier about streaming participants. So the way we worked the different bays was we had 2 green bays, 2 amber bays, and 2 red. And that was representative of how the volunteers were going to be streamed in terms of their knowledge base, but also where we want them to get them to. So we had 6 bays within that sort of space. So 2 greens, 2 ambers, 2 reds. So as you can see here from this particular slide, we were still building at this point, but we were using tables to put mannequins on as beds, as we didn't have beds at this point. And we were also using bays to sort of denote and mark out the actual size of the ITU bays. So when participants came to us, what we were able to do was put them into a confined space that would be representative of what they'll be working within when they go onto the shop floor. So bearing in mind that we were using chairs as ventilators and hangers for drip stands, I had a discussion with Paul at King's College London, and we decided that actually there was an awful lot that we could do in terms of bridging fidelity. So at this point, Paul very kindly sent over pictures of ventilators and then pictures of pumps. So anything that we didn't physically have available to us, i.e. as a consumable or as a hard piece of kit, we used pictures to depict this. And as you can see from the picture on the left, I've actually taped it to the drip stand. So at one point we had it taped to the chair, and I thought, actually, let's get it onto the drip stand and let's try and recreate or increase the fidelity as far as possible. And we even went as far as to putting syringes onto the pumps, again, labeling what they were. I think that was a stroke of genius by Tim, who actually pointed that one out to me. So as we're starting to collect more kits and some of our sponsors are very kindly donating stuff, we were able to increase fidelity. So what you'll see here are 2 anesthetic machines which were donated by Royal College of Anaesthetists. And what we've got there are 2 compressors. So bearing in mind, we're essentially in what is a lecture room, if you will. So there's no piped gases at all, which meant that if we wanted to increase fidelity, i.e. run mannequins that were ventilatable, we needed equipment to be able to do that. So what you'll see is on the top left picture, there's an anesthetic machine to the left-hand side of it, but actually to the right-hand side, we've got what's compressors. So they were electrically driven, but created gas, which were donated by Royal College of Anaesthetists via SLE. And we were able to then plug in the machines and actually ventilate mannequins. So we've started to increase the fidelity. We're up in the ante. So we've gone from sticking syringes to a chair, and now we've actually got anaesthetic machines. And fortuitously, at the Nightingale, what we were using in the first instances of ventilating patients were anaesthetic machines. So unbeknown to me, it was an opportunity to actually test the anaesthetic machines in real time as part of training, as opposed to you giving them something to use that they're not necessarily going to be using in practice. Next slide. So moving on to the clinical skills, again, looking at the floor plan when I first got to Centre Ed, we identified that this would be probably the best room to create the clinical skills circuit. So this essentially is where we ran all of our part-task training. So this would be things around cannulation, central line insertion, ultrasound training, things like that. So it was all the part-task training, catheterization. We had other rooms, breakout rooms, which is where we would host PPE, so personal protective equipment. There was a communication station as well, where we'd use some sign language based on what divers use. We do a donning and doffing stage, which is where they get an opportunity to put the PPE on, but also take it off safely. So there were other sort of more involved stations, but all the part tasks happened in this particular room here. Next slide. So again, going back to what I just said, there was PPE, there was a part task training that was around airway, and there was things around eye care, mouth care, cannulation. There's proning stations and pressure care, things like that. And the slide on the right is a picture of the comms piece that we had. Next slide. So once we had it all up and running, and I had to sort of manage my expectations within this, thinking that I wanted to recreate an actual ITU bay, and I did have discussions with the builders at the Nightingale shop floor, ITU floor, if we could get some of those built up in the centre ed, but I think that was probably a stretch too far. They were still building the hospital as we were doing this. So we got settled, we started running training, and actually we got a really good system going. But if you look at the picture in front, the corridor itself doesn't lend itself very well to social distancing. So what we tried to do was have a circuit whereby they would use the corridors to go down in numbers for the rooms, and they'd use the walkway outside to go up the numbers. But again, given the size of the rooms, actually, social distancing was very difficult to maintain. So as we ramped up the numbers in training, what we noticed was actually there was a decrease in faculty and going off with COVID-like symptoms. We then got a brief in terms of what it was we were expected to do. But with that in mind, we were starting to lose faculty, and we didn't have the capacity to increase the numbers because of the space we were using. Next slide. But there was one good thing that came out of all of this. By the time we'd finished at the Excel, what we had was a very good picture image of what the ITU bays looked like along with their equipment. So we had an equipment list, but we also had a visual of what we were trying to recreate, which was useful for the guys that aren't necessarily clinically focused or have a clinical understanding. They're able to look at the picture and say, right, I know how to put that, I know where to get that, and I could put that into a bay. But what we previously were working off was around a worksheet, an Excel chart with a load of writing on it, which was quite difficult to do. So at least this time we had something to work on, a definitive picture in terms of what we were trying to recreate. Next slide. So the next venue, one that I would like to have played in a different capacity, but nonetheless I'll take training education there, was at the O2. So what was decided was that in order to increase the numbers, but also to maintain social distancing, the closest venue for us to be able to deliver this would be the O2. So off to the O2 we went. So first day we got there, we went for a bit of a scoping exercise to understand what was available to us, but what was the most appropriate use of the space that is available to us. So I must say I was very lucky in that I had the luxury of actually having the O2 Arena floor, one that I don't think I'll ever get again in my lifetime, but I'll be happy to take that. So we had a blank canvas. But having sort of reflected on lessons learnt, what could we do with the space? So the O2 Arena manager, which was Octavia, very kindly reached out to the builders at the Nightingale and managed to get us 24 bays built on the arena shop floor, which for me was just mind-blowing. It's a case of, wow, we could do something pretty good with this. So with that, my tail was up and I was up for the challenge. So off we went. This is a really good video of how we sort of used the army to help bring in the stuff. So it's a bit of a time-lapse video. So the stuff from the Excel was delivered to us in bits and pieces at the O2 Arena. We had a brief in the morning in terms of the layout, the footprint of the arena itself, but also some of the rooms that they use for hosting stars. And then we decided that this is how we was going to set the bays up. So in my head, because we had 24 bays, we would have 4 circuits per color. So 4 green, 4 amber, 4 red. Given the limitations of availability of equipment and mannequins, we decided that the green would be the high fidelity. That's where we'd put the mannequins that were ventilatable, but also that's where we'd put any kit or equipment that we had access to, i.e. pumps. We'd put them into those bays because the greens would require a higher level of training. So we decided to put the greens with a higher fidelity. The ambers, we tend to drop down the fidelity a little bit. And then the reds, again, we use a lot of pictures. So going back to the sort of first iteration of what we did at the Nightingale or the XL, we use a lot of the stuff there, the pictures, to sort of bridge the gaps in terms of fidelity. So as you can see, the military are now involved. What I found working alongside the military was things get done, and they get done pretty damn quick. There's no messing around. We have a plan. Everybody has a role within that plan. You get people to understand, but also to articulate any concerns they have, and then off you go. So we had literally about 7 hours to build what essentially was 12 bays for simulation training. Happy to go on. So once we'd actually finished with the build, you can see here, this is what we ended up with, which is essentially the picture on the right is where we've got two bays. The first iteration of this was that I wanted to keep the bays side by side and then have a break between the colors. So we'd have two green bays, a break, two yellow bays, amber bays, a break, two red bays, and a break. But what we found was that social distancing was quite difficult, but equally the technicians that were driving these mannequins had to do it from 2 bays away. So after the first run, we decided that we'd then do a bay on bay off essentially, which lent itself to social distancing, but also meant that the techs then had room to either operate the mannequin on the right to them or to the left, which seemed to work pretty well. And once we'd made that change, it seems to have stuck. The picture on the left, you can see of a mannequin. And again, what we've got there, pumps are still on the wall at this point. We're still having the challenge of trying to get some. The Nightingale still didn't have any at that point. But we had the anesthetic machine. We had piped gases via the compressor. We had beds with pressure care mattresses. We had suction units. So again, going back, from the first days at the XL to what we had at the Arena, was pretty good in terms of representing what they would encounter when they hit the shop floor at the Nightingale. So this is a panoramic picture of the setup. So you've got the first 6 bays would have been our greens, and then moving down amber, and then down onto red. At the bottom is where they did PPE. What we used to do was get participants as far as possible to do the clinical skills stuff first, to get the underpinning knowledge and the skills acquisition beforehand, then do PPE. Again, the timetable was dynamic depending on what was going on, how many circuits we were running, and then we wanted them to come to us to do their full immersion scenarios in PPE. So as you can see from this, this is where we started to do some of the clinical skills circuits. Because we had quite a bit of kit around to us, what we were able to do was create circuits for colours. So one part of the O2, we were able to do purples as they evolved over time. Greens would do a different circuit, reds would do a different circuit. But we started to refine how we were doing things, but also we started to use the space much more appropriately. We didn't have the luxury of space back at the XL or Centre Ed, but we certainly had it at the O2, and we started to make more use of that. Next slide. I mentioned quite early on that the techs were the people that I went to, were my go-to people in the first instance, in terms of bringing this stuff to life and making it happen. And I think one of my favorite stations was this, and I can't remember who made it, but I think it's absolutely outstanding. We started to adjust some of our stations to reflect circulation or invasive monitoring. So a couple of the techs, or if not one, built this station, which is essentially our invasive monitoring station, which was quite nice. And what we've got there is a combination of part-task trainers put together with some consumables, where we then do a bit of training for a particular group on it. But I think that's probably one of the best constructions I've seen in a very long time in terms of combining part-task trainers to deliver a station. So that pretty much charts my journey from the beginning, which was at the Nightingale, up to and including the O2. And as we sort of drew towards the end of our tour, if you will, what became apparent was that we were still loosely working our simulations on work as imagined. So I started to spend a bit more time over at the Nightingale, spending time with the bedside learning coordinators, and Nick will talk a bit about that afterwards, but I started to look at some of the other data and trying to get a better understanding of work as done. I wanted the simulations that we were doing to be representative of what they're going to encounter in practice. So we started to look at serious incidences, and again, what were the themes that were coming out of those, and how can we use those to inform the simulations that we were running. But I wanted to bridge the gap between what was happening at the O2 to what they might encounter on the shop floor at the Nightingale. I thought that was important. And again, using some of the human factors elements and the non-technical skills and weaving that into our scenarios. And if that was a source of an incident, we would use that or highlight that more so in our discussions post scenarios. That's it. That's my journey at the Nightingale, highs and lows, ups and downs, but nonetheless, it was an extraordinary journey and one that I'm grateful that I was invited to embark upon. But I'd also like to thank all of the industry that supported us throughout the project. There's lots of you out there, but equally the faculty that started out with me, Tim and Louise, but also everyone else that supported this project. Thank you to you all. It's been a pleasure.
Very good. Thank you so much, Clinton. We're going to come back to you later for questions. So for the audience that's sending us questions right now, we will get to those after our next speaker, who is Dr. Nick Murch. Doctor, welcome. Dr. Murch is a consultant in acute medicine and lead for in situ simulation at Nightingale London. In situ is a passion of many of ours at Laerdal. So hope you're going to drill in on that. And there's a saying, practice how you play, but also practice where you play. And you're going to show us exactly how you set up an environment where people can do that. So thank you, Dr. Murch. We're going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you for asking me to speak today. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So this is what I was, what we met on the first day. So I joined as a member of the faculty approximately 3 days after Clinton, and this was the view that we met on the first day before they covered the windows up. So just to put it into context for international audience, this is basically a field hospital that was going to look to house up to 4,000 patients, with 500 patients in the first instance, most of whom would come in intubated with central venous access. And the plan was that this may be required in the East End of London, but the hope, as per the speaker from Norway earlier on, was it wouldn't be required. However, we were preparing for the worst. So as you can see, this area, which is normally used for conferences in the East End of London and the Docklands, was picked primarily because of its good transport links and the local hotels. Also the fact it's very, very close to London City Airport, and we could get supplies in and do transfers. So as you can see here, one of the main tenets of crisis resource management is to think about knowing your environment. And the first problem we had was that we didn't know our environment, because we could see that, but we didn't actually know what the plan was. And another tenet is to use all available resources. So in the end, we Googled what the plans were for the Nightingale Hospital. We found this on the Daily Mail website, which is a paper that I wouldn't normally read, but actually showed us where we would be working. And actually the Centre Ed building that we were in, it was the corridor at the bottom of this, which is overlooking the dock. It was up on the second floor, and you had to have about a 20-minute walk around to the clinical area in order to actually have any interaction with people in the clinical space. One of the issues that we had was that we were trying to sail a boat which hadn't actually been fully finished yet. So the boat had left port, which was a hospital. We didn't know who the crew were going to be, and we didn't know what equipment we were going to have. And that was going to be difficult. We didn't know what masks we were going to have, what rigging. We didn't know which ventilators we were going to be using, which ultrasound machines, which pumps we'd be using, or where the staff would be going from. We didn't know if the crew would be competent and where they would come from to begin with. And so it was actually quite a movable feast. So we tried to design a program of education, and I started off over in the centre ed in order to try and help with that. So this is one of the more interesting things I think about the Nightingale Hospital, which was a clinical forum which happened at 4 o'clock every day, where because we had a green space, which meant that people were not siloed as per usual, people were in the same room and able to have conversations. And it was actually at this meeting that I put my hand up and said I would be happy to lead on in situ simulation as they were looking for somebody. And this point of care simulation would be really useful for us to try and test some of the systems, looking for latent errors in the clinical arena, but also to test the SOPs which had been written, but perhaps hadn't been tried out in an area that hadn't even been finished yet. And so as Clinton mentioned earlier on, this was with regards to looking at work as done as opposed to work as imagined in an area that is imagined. So you can imagine that this was difficult. One of the issues, as I mentioned earlier on, was that there was a 20-minute walk from the centre ed area down to the clinical area. So actually having any interaction was difficult. So we had to use social media, WhatsApp, etc., to try and share information, up-to-date SOPs, etc., between the two. But it did mean that the education side could lead into the clinical picture, and the clinical picture could also feed back into the education team. And I'll come back to this 4 o'clock forum later on. Some of the key people here were the people in the foreground who were the Clear 33 team who helped to provide interaction between the clinical and education teams. As you can see, it wasn't just us that was simulating. The military was simulating bringing in patients to London City Airport, and the plan was, if required, that patients would have been brought in via Chinook and then transferred via ambulance over to us. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that I went to the Nightingale Hospital was that I'd helped to stand up the team for the part of the response to the COVID pandemic at the Royal Free Hospital in London, which is where I work normally as a lead for acute medicine. And that was one of the hospitals that had set up and taken some of the patients who were relatively well to begin with, but had then taken patients who required intensive care and were one of the hardest hit hospitals in London and one of the first to be hit. We'd actually, the team at the Royal Free had done some simulation in situ and ITU literally hours before their admission with their first COVID patient into the intensive care unit. So I was going to be working there clinically as well as in the education side. So I felt that I was going to be a very helpful point of contact between the two areas. Next slide, please. So one of the things that happened with me going across clinically was that I was able to get access to what was actually happening on the ground. So here was a map which we finally managed to see. And if you look in the bottom right-hand area with the red dotted line, that shows where the original 500 beds were going to be set up. There was actually a demountable wall between outside that red area, such that later on when we tried to set up an in situ sim area, which proved difficult due to a relative lack of personal protective equipment, and we had considered, as your colleague said earlier on, using homemade equipment, but we were talking about using FFP2 masks rather than FFP3 masks, such that we were using the correct measures for communication. And we actually later on set up a in situ or day zero sim area in Emerton ward, which was going to be in the clinical area, set up as clinical, but we didn't necessarily have to have full PPE due to relative shortages in the NHS at that time. What that meant was that we were now orientated, knew what was going to happen. The admissions happened down in the bottom right-hand corner in Florence South, and they would be taken in. And the first area that was open clinically was Bedford B, and we were going to open up later. It was agreed we could open up Emerton as a training area. Because it was a green space physically, but also operationally. So it meant that people were not in their own silos. People did not have their own areas that they stayed in. There was, in my impression, smaller egos, and you might have found in other places where you had established ways of working. That's the way we do things here. And it meant that people could come together in an interprofessional way with a very flat hierarchy in order to try and deliver education and care. Next slide, please. So this is one of the key signs that was up on the wall in the clinical forum area, which is where people worked in the daytime and then they met at 4 o'clock to discuss what work had happened that day. And this was along the Richard Bomer model. What do we know? What do we not know? And what can people help you with today? So it's very helpful actually to have a discussion in the room, be able to see who could help you. And it was trying to clearly signpost the members of the interaction with the education team, the Clear 33 team, and myself and Bryn Baxendale, who were there to help to deliver some of the education, as well as the ergonomics, and have a point of contact back to the team, which halfway through this process moved over to the O2, which for people who don't know, London is the other side of the river, and there's no direct access because the cable car was very intermittent, and driving around would take about 20 minutes. So actually trying to get that communication proved a issue moving forwards. What we had tried was to do 2 simulated admissions via that bottom right hand corner of the map, and tried to look at that to see how that would work, and touch base with the London Ambulance Service. So that 4 o'clock forum, the plan was that we would have a discussion, and the learning model from the Nightingale, which had been kindly shared with me by James Mountford and his team, was that the external advisory group, which was via UCL Partners, which is a clinical academic group across North Central and East London out into Essex, would advise about any real changes to what we should be doing clinically, that there was a quality and leadership, quality and learning, apologies, change team who would drive that change and move it around, and change validation and authorization. It was agreed all of that change would happen in the 4 o'clock clinical forum meeting. The plan was that simulation testing and research could then drive any changes in real time and relatively rapidly in order to feed back into that 4 o'clock meeting. And then the plan was to implement interaction. The internal data was collected by the bedside learning coordinator, which is a relatively new role, which I hadn't heard of before, and I believe was being piloted here. And this was going to be people that were on the ground, collecting data from people on the ground, doing a full shift where possible, and finding out what had gone well, what wasn't quite going so well, and trying to find, for example, datixes that needed to be put in, and then feed that back into the quality and learning team in order to change what we were doing on the ground, and then that to drive itself via simulation testing and operationally. So it was a very rapid feedback mechanism that was required because this hospital was only open for a matter of weeks. And then that was implemented interaction and shared nationally and internationally, with the idea that we could try to test out the SOPs in the area that was available. Next slide, please. So as you can see, this is a type of rapid feedback that could develop. So from one shift to the next shift, the plan was that anything that was found to be really important was just going to be flagged up to the incoming team. So if a DATIX, which is a clinical incident report, had been reported, it could be fed back into the incoming team at the next shift, which is really rapid, up-to-date feedback, and meant that the learning that we were trying to achieve in the clinical area was most useful. Next slide, please. So this was the clinical area when it was finally set up, and this was the area that we then set up in order to get the in situ simulation established. And it was really, really useful to have an area set up. The plan originally was that we would go into the area where we would need full PPE, and in order to have that in situ, people would have to go in either during their shift or at separate time test shifts in one of the wards, which was going to be requiring full PPE. Due to limitations in the availability of PPE across NHS and the world, in all honesty, the plan was that we would try and do in situ simulation in an area that didn't necessarily require full PPE, and meant that communication would be clearer. One of the things that we found out was that we did do in situ simulation in the clinical area prior to it opening, and we did simulate some admissions, cardiac arrests, timed how long it took for people to get to CT, for example, and did a number of other simulations, including proning, prior to us requiring PPE. But once the area was operational, it became more difficult. So it was agreed that although we could do just-in-time type learning in the clinical area, it would be more useful to have an area which was just down the corridor, which could be set up to mimic the official area, and would be a stepping stone for people that had not been exposed to a clinical area previously. So going from the fidelity, which increased at the O2, to an area like this where they're in the same sort of hangar that they would be just down the corridor with the noise lost upwards, and then if required they could move into the clinical area at a later date. The fact that what we tried to do for this was we tried to set up an innovative process called Day Zero Sim, which we ran a couple of pilots for. So this was where people would be structured to work the day before their first clinical shift, and they were to come into this clinical area in order to, and this is us setting up for it, in order to have a stepping stone into what it was going to be like in the arena. The idea was that this would be led by the education team coming across, but also with people working in the clinical arena. And you can see Clinton on the left there discussing with the team about ergonomics, but also what was really important was the technical aspects of how people use this equipment. So actually it wouldn't be simulation as we knew it, but a lot of it's going to be technical skills, such as how does a ventilator work if you're used to, an anaesthetic machine work if you're used to working in intensive care with ventilators. How do pumps work that you've not seen before? How does a defibrillator work, etc. This was a multidisciplinary process which was largely driven by the nurses. And as you can see, Professor Bench in the middle there, and Andrea is one of our ward sisters who helped us to try and deliver this. And we set up a mannequin in this area. This was going to be a stepping stone in order for us to move forwards into the clinical area, and people could do a day shift, in inverted commas, in order to move forwards before going into the clinical area. One of the key things was the fact that the team were going to have a pre-brief before going into the area, meet the team that they were likely to be working with, and actually have a full team debrief, which was interprofessional post-shift. And this is something new that I hadn't really seen before. So this is the Day Zero Sim here, and this is one of my colleagues, Simon Fleming, going through some of the equipment and going through the day as we would perceive it to be, with feedback from people that were on the clinical floor. So therefore it would be work as done and not necessarily work as imagined. Obviously our model was moving as we went on. After this, the plan was that they would debrief together, and also the team would all go for meals together, which isn't always possible in hospitals where you've already often got clear areas where people would go to rest between shifts. What this meant was that we were role modelling how we thought people should behave when they went into the clinical area. Next shift, please. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that we touched upon at the Nightingale was the fact that psychological PPE, which was a survival kit for a safer culture, was highlighted by Jean Hardacre and Alexander Margetts, as well as Chloe Kitts from the wellbeing team and the rest of the members of that team. And one of the key things that was pushed in the induction and in the Day Zero Sim was the fact that you've got to check up on each other. Check that they are, check that before you go in, check your own physical PPE for risk of infection, but also have just a second just to check, am I okay? And is my colleague okay? And checking on their well-being. And this is one of the articles that they wrote with regards to this for the BMJ blogs, which was really innovative moving forwards. Next slide, please. So that's the end of really what we wanted to talk about. So it was designed for a model that may take up to 4,000 patients in the end. Luckily, it only took just over 50 in total. But the education team was really lauded for the progress that they made. They had trained over 2,700 people to get through the system, many of whom had never been in healthcare before. And the resources which were available through the excellent team, including Libby Thomas and Colette and others who were working on the content, is available free of access at the website there. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the platform, and thank you for your help with setting up the Nightingale.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Clinton. We're going to bring you both online here if we can to address some audience questions and some questions we have too on our own. So you provided a wealth of information already on one question we wanted to get to, which was your training methodology, and how do you get people that where you may need to appeal or design to the lowest common denominator with so many new people coming in, or people returning to the healthcare workforce, and then fast tracking them through to a level of competency and confidence that will allow them to perform. So it looks like you did what we would call a low dose, high frequency method, or sort of a drip feed method. But it's interesting that you had what you're calling a stepping stone model, and a work as done, not as not work as imagined model. In the context of that, so two questions. Behind simulation, there's often other learning techniques. There could be, Clinton, you know from your military days, memorization, right? You memorize everything. Or there's an acronym for everything, just to plant it in your head. Were there extra techniques that you used there? And then I'll get to the next question in just a moment.
For me?
Sure. This is we're tossing the ball here, so however it works for either of you. So go ahead, Clinton.
So sure. So in terms of simulation, what we looked at was blended approach. Given that this was to rapidly upskill people in a very short space of time, what's the best way or fastest way of getting people to hit the ground running? So we looked at a combination of methods, and Leanne looked at some of the content, some of the e-learning for Skills for Health. So what could we use from that in terms of preparing them before they come to us? There was e-learning, there was some of the didactic stuff that we would be able to do to a certain extent. And then there was something around giving them the skills, so the practical stuff. We did use acronyms for some of the greens, but we found that was probably a step too far for the ambers and definitely for the reds. And what we found was actually what we started out with in terms of a program evolved, it changed. And that changed on the back of the people that were coming to us, who we thought were coming to us with a certain set of skills, actually weren't the people that were turning up. So a lot of what we did, certainly with the full immersion sim, it was, as Tim described, adaptive sim. So what we did was, Louise and Tim, I'd asked them to do a relatively gross needs analysis of who's in the room and try and re-cohort them to a sort of knowledge base and identify what's their knowledge base. And then what you're able to then do is titrate the scenario or the sim to what it was they were going to be potentially walking out with. So in terms of the acronyms, we tried to keep that away from the reds and the ambers, because there was a lot of information. What we didn't want was to give them information overload. But what I was quite keen on doing was giving cognitive aids. What can they take onto the shop floor that's easily to hand and to be able to sort of reference from? And the greens, who were coming to us with a good set of skills, again, it was probably reinforcing the Nightingale way as opposed to their local way.
Sure. Nick, anything to add to that before I ask the next part of the question?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add that the red, amber, and green was a self-assessment, and which was relatively high risk, I suppose. But people would turn up, and they would often, well, not often, but there was a proportion of people that would have self-triaged into the inappropriate group, and they needed to be siphoned off at the front door. So it was very much a blended approach and directed at who was in the room, but actually we often didn't know who was turning up or what their capabilities were going to be until they arrived. So it had to be quite agile approach that was used by the team.
So the next part of the question, thank you. The next part of the question goes back to those boards that you had that had certain messaging daily for everyone. With this kind of rapid cycle simulation, how were you able to prioritize each day that that 80-20 cut at what you really wanted to focus on first and foremost as you triage priorities for learning going forward? Nick, I'll turn that over to you first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So at the 4 o'clock clinical forum meeting every day, it was agreed what the top 3 priorities were going to be, and these were agreed by the people in the room, and they were the message that went out, and that was triaged by the quality and learning team. And it was useful that was fed in, and then there was also somebody who met people on the incoming shift, which was named the tactical commander, which might be a bit military and wasn't particularly popular with the people doing it, but was basically an ops person that would meet the incoming team and explain to them the key messages for that day and what might have changed since the day before. And then also to direct them to the available resources. So there was a lot of online resources available in the clinical area and about where they found them, and a lot of signposting. I mean, the original plan was that people might start in a phased approach. People may start a shift at, say, 4 p.m. until 4 a.m. Other people might start at 2 a.m. until 2 p.m. if it had gone to big bang with the entire number. Luckily, this wasn't required, and it was just one sort of changeover shift pattern every 12.5 hours. But I can imagine that if it had been rapid cycle with more and more people coming through, that these messages would become more and more important.
Okay, very good. I'm going to turn over to, and being conscious of time, I'm going to turn over to some questions we received on debriefing. So debriefing to someone's clinical skills can be very different from debriefing to behavioral skills, especially when you're trying to develop a team. So how did you approach debriefing when you had an interdisciplinary team working together who may not have had experience working in well, likely with the people they were thrown in with, but also likely just working across different disciplines. So how did you approach debriefing to drive certain messages home to everybody?
So in terms of the sim, I think myself and Colette had a discussion quite early on back at the beginning when we was at KPMG. And again, this was all designed on work as imagined, but also simulation as imagined. And I think we decided that given the time constraints, a proper debrief wouldn't be possible. So we opted to use plus delta as a relatively quick and effective method of getting to the crux of the matter. What we also found was, given the way faculty were coming to us, there was variability in people's ability to debrief, but also the tools and models they may have been familiar with or not. So we stuck with plus delta. I think it's probably fair to say that although we aspired to run full immersion sim, where you'd have the scenario and you'd have time dedicated to a good debrief, that wasn't possible for a lot of the time, and that was down to the mix in people that were coming to us and volunteers. So plus delta, so we although we were using high fidelity equipment, we were doing low fidelity sim with plus delta to unpick some of the points that may have come out through the skills and drills training, if you will.
No, so a follow-on question. First of all, some listeners may not be familiar with the plus delta term. And also, prior to a simulation in this kind of an environment, did you have very specific learning objectives that everyone was read or informed on before your sim began?
Yeah, so whenever we ran the scenarios, the faculty always had a huddle to get an understanding of what the plan was for this particular cohorts that are coming through. We also took the opportunity to do a little needs analysis of who was coming through to then inform how we're going to titrate our simulation to it. But we stuck with the plus delta. I think towards the end, we sort of evolved, and what we were able to do was bridge the gap between what was going on at the Nightingale to how we were going to tease out some of these things in the debrief, if you will. But that happened probably later on. I think that was a failing on my behalf in that I lost sight of, once we moved to the O2, I felt disconnected, or became disconnected from the Nightingale, and that gap wasn't bridged until the end. So that was a failing on my behalf.
Well, that's responsible debriefing, right? So kudos to you for showing ownership. Bjorn, I know that you want to take over, so I just want to thank I want to thank Dr. John and Dr. Murch and everyone involved at Nightingale for your service during this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to hand the microphone over to you again, Andrew, in the beginning of next hour, not next week. And now we're going to run a video from our CEO.